Hello, family and friends. Thank you so much for joining us tonight for our midweek Bible study. We are looking at the book of Galatians, and we're in chapter 2 for tonight's study. So if you'll turn there with me, we'll begin reading there in just a moment. I think one of the reasons tonight's text is so important is because it talks about unity. And it's also important because Paul wants to tell us that in preserving that unity that Jesus died to give us, it's important for us to know where it is we stand. I don't really like talking about it, but an uncomfortable percentage of my life in ministry has been spent in conflict resolution. And I don't think it should be that way in the church, but yet because the church is full of flawed people like we all are, there are times of conflict. Anytime I go to a conference or a continuing education seminar, it seems like the conflict resolution classes are always the most well attended. Well, we're going to see in this study that Paul struggled to make things the way they ought to be. And we see him in our text for tonight standing firm and fighting, really, for something truly worth fighting for. So, what is it that Paul is fighting for? He's fighting for the gospel of Jesus Christ. Paul would gladly give ground on lesser matters, but on the gospel itself, he would stand and he would fight. In fact, I think this is probably the foundation of what we're going to look at tonight. If I could sum it up in one sentence, I would sum it up this way. Maintaining the purity and truthfulness of the gospel is a battle worth fighting. Now, before we get too far along, I want to give you some background. I want us to do a little bit of a review. Paul had established churches, you remember, in the Gentile region of Galatia, which is our modern-day Turkey. And after he left the region, some false brothers who claimed to be from Jerusalem came to Galatia, and they began undermining everything that Paul had taught, all that he had built. And these false teachers confused these new Gentile Christians by attacking Paul's apostleship and his teaching. We've already talked about that some, about how the false teachers told the new Gentile Christians that in order to be saved, they had to believe the gospel and they also had to be circumcised and follow the Mosaic law. It was almost like they said something to this effect. Sure, Christ is the door to salvation, but Moses is like the screen door. Well, whenever Paul heard about the influence that the false teachers were having on the Galatians, he immediately wrote this short yet passionate letter to them that we know as Galatians. In chapter 1, we've seen how Paul defended his gospel. We see how he defended his apostleship because that was being attacked. And he did this by showing that his gospel and apostleship were not dependent on human teaching or on the Jerusalem apostles or churches. His apostleship, his gospel came directly from God. So today, in chapter 2, we're going to see how Paul demonstrates that even though his gospel didn't come from the Jerusalem apostles, his gospel was endorsed by these Jerusalem pillars, as he calls them. Paul uses both sides of the argument to support his gospel and to support his ministry. On the one side, he's argued that his gospel was independent of the Jerusalem apostles, but now, on the other side, he wants to demonstrate that his gospel is endorsed by these Jerusalem pillars. That endorsement really wasn't necessary since God had directly endorsed Paul, but the endorsement of the Jerusalem apostles takes the wind out of the sails of these false teachers that we call Judaizers. So I'm going to read to you from Galatians chapter 2, starting verse 1. He says, 14 years later, I went up with Barnabas. I took Titus along also. I went in response to a revelation and set before them the gospel that I preach among the Gentiles. But I did this privately to those who seemed to be leaders, for fear that I was running or had run my race in vain. Yet not even Titus, who was with me, was compelled to be circumcised, even though he was a Greek. This matter arose because some false brothers had infiltrated our ranks to spy on the freedom that we have in Christ Jesus and to make us slaves. We did not give in to them for a moment, so that the truth of the gospel might remain with you. As for those who seem to be important, whatever they were makes no difference to me. God does not judge by external appearances. Those men added nothing to my message. On the contrary, they saw that I had been entrusted with the task of preaching the gospel to the Gentiles, just as Peter had been to the Jews. For God, who was at work in the ministry of Peter as an apostle to the Jews, was also at work in my ministry as an apostle to the Gentiles. James, Peter, and John, those reputed to be pillars, gave me and Barnabas the right hand of fellowship when they recognized the grace given to me. They agreed that we should go to the Gentiles and they to the Jews. All they asked was that we should continue to remember the poor, the very thing I was eager to do. Now, these verses that we just read, verses 1 through 10, they are not just travelogue or a report of a meeting of some apostles. There are some really important principles to be learned and utilized from this text. And the first one is this: there was and is only one gospel. You remember we talked about that a lot back in chapter 1. Secondly, the truth of the gospel must be maintained. And thirdly, we are responsible to study and pray in order that our gospel be that gospel of God. Now, Paul starts off by telling about this visit to Jerusalem. His first private visit to Jerusalem was 3 years after his conversion, and now he says after 14 years later, he makes his second visit to Jerusalem. And he took with him two important co-workers. He took Barnabas and Titus. Let me tell you a little bit about Barnabas. Barnabas was one of the first brothers to trust Paul after his conversion. And the second of them, and the two of them, made the first missionary journey together. Barnabas must have been a courageous man because he accepted Paul, even with Paul's reputation back whenever he was Saul and killing all of those Christians. I know several writers talk about Barnabas and they call him the disciple of a second chance. I love that. That's the way Barnabas was with Saul. Then there was Titus. You remember Paul trained him and later sent him to minister on Crete, and there he received the New Testament letter that we know as Titus. Now, Paul tells us that he made this trip to Jerusalem because of revelation. God somehow prompted Paul, led Paul to make this trip. And the reason for the visit was to share his mission of preaching the gospel to the Gentiles. Paul didn't need their authorization, but he knew that if the leaders of the early church were not all on the same page and all in agreement, then the future of Christianity would be in jeopardy. And Paul didn't want to minister for years and then find out that it was all in vain. He didn't question whether the Jerusalem apostles had the full gospel, but he did fear that they might not be true to the gospel by standing up to these false teachers. And it was crucial that Paul took Titus along also because Titus was a Gentile Christian who had not been circumcised. And these false brothers who had infiltrated their ranks would have insisted that Titus had to be circumcised in order to be saved. They would have said probably something like, yes, Titus needs Christ to be saved, but he also needs to live according to the Jewish law. So, with Titus, Paul confronted the other apostles with a concrete test case, if you will. So, would the Jerusalem apostles require Titus to be circumcised or not? If you step back from the situation, you can clearly see the three parties that are involved in the question of Titus's circumcision. First of all, you've got Paul and Barnabas, whose conviction was that Gentile Christians did not need to be circumcised in order to be saved. Secondly, you had those false teachers who contended that Gentiles had to receive the gospel and follow the Mosaic law in order to be saved. And then thirdly, you had the Jerusalem apostles who definitely agreed with Paul, and I'm sure they would have wanted everyone to get along. I'm sure they would have wanted to find a way to compromise with both of the other groups. It would have been easy for those Jerusalem apostles to say that circumcision was not necessary, but should be done as a concession for expediency to maintain unity. Now, I want to say this. Expediency is not intrinsically wrong. Conciliation is many times an honorable path. But the question is, what is being sacrificed for expediency's sake? Paul says that he did not yield to them even for a moment, so that the truth of the gospel might be preserved. Had Paul yielded and his opponents won, then the freedom of the gospel would have been lost, and we would have been left with a perverted and false gospel. Thankfully, by God's grace, those Jerusalem apostles rose to the occasion and did not insist that Titus be circumcised. Their acceptance of Titus was proof that they had accepted Paul's ministry and Paul's message. Now, I want you to notice how Paul properly dealt with people in authority. You can look back at verses 6 through 9. On the one hand, he expressed respect for those in authority, but then on the other hand, he refused to be intimidated by those in authority. Paul understood that God shows no partiality. Those who think they are something because of their position, they have no favored standing with God over anybody else. If a person is not right with God and is not teaching what is right, then they have no protection just because of their position. Paul reports several things about the Jerusalem apostles' endorsement. First of all, they added nothing to Paul's message and ministry. Nothing about Paul's message or ministry needed correction or addition. Secondly, they officially recognized Paul's special calling. Peter and Paul had the same gospel, but each had separate targets for their ministry. You remember, Peter was going to reach out to the Jews. Paul was going to reach out to the Gentiles. And then thirdly, they officially gave the right hand of fellowship. Now, I want to tell you, that was more than just a handshake, or more than just a pat on the back or an affirmation. It was like an official agreement, like signing a contract. Before Paul finished this section, he mentioned one last thing in chapter 2 and verse 10. It said, "We want you to remember this. You need to take care of the poor." Now notice that this is the only thing they asked of Paul. Okay, that's our background. Now let's make some application. As we've moved through these first 10 verses of Galatians 2, we've tried to understand the truth that there are some things that are worth fighting for. And in Paul's mind, the most important thing worth fighting for is the gospel. Now, that's a theme that we've been working with in each of our lessons in Galatians so far. Because we live in a culture that values emotion above reason. This culture that we live in today values tolerance above truth. There's nothing wrong with emotion, and there's nothing wrong with tolerance. But what I'm getting at is this. Most in this generation are very uncomfortable with the notion that there is a God who has spoken, and that what God has said is the absolute truth. There are a number of important things about the gospel that are worth fighting for. The gospel includes the fact that Jesus is the only way. John chapter 14 and verse 6, he says, "I am the way, the truth, and the life. No man comes to the Father except through me." For many people, that's far too exclusive and too narrow-minded. But let me say this, we do not do lost people any favors by watering down the truth about Jesus, or about sin, or about righteousness, or about judgment. The next thing I think Paul would tell us about the gospel that is worth fighting for is the fact that we are saved by grace. The gospel says that we are saved by what God has done for us, not what we have done for him. We are saved by Jesus and not by Jesus plus anything else. That was the difference between Paul's gospel and the gospel of the Judaizers. The second we begin to think that we can be saved by anything other than the grace of God, then we have fallen from grace. The third thing about the gospel that is worth fighting for is the fact that the gospel is for everyone. It reminds me of what the Apostle Paul said in Romans chapter 1 and verse 16, where he said, "I am not ashamed of the gospel, because it is the power of God for the salvation of everyone who believes, first for the Jew and then for the Gentile." The gospel has the power to save people without regard to anything distinctive about them. The gospel is for everyone, regardless of nationality or race or color or age or gender or education or morality or income or anything else that people use today to divide us. If we are a faithful church, then we ought to consider that the makeup of our congregation should be as diverse as the population of our region. Something for us to think about. If we are faithful to the gospel, then we should be actively sharing it with every different kind of people that we come in contact with. The other lesson that comes out of this section is what he says that the poor are worth fighting for. The only thing that the Jerusalem apostles emphasized with Paul was remembering the poor. Isn't that interesting? Of all the other important things that they might want to remind Paul of, the only thing that they mentioned was the poor. Caring for the poor is often a blind spot for many people, and I'm going to say including many Christians. Did you know that the Bible contains more than 300 verses about the poor, about social justice, and about God's deep concern for both? Let's just read some, like Deuteronomy chapter 15 and verse 11. "For there will never cease to be poor in the land. Therefore I command you, you shall open wide your hand to your brother, to the needy, and to the poor in your land." Or how about Psalm 82 and verse 3? "Give justice to the weak and the fatherless. Maintain the right of the afflicted and the destitute. Rescue the weak and the needy. Deliver them from the hand of the wicked." Or how about Proverbs 14, verse 31? Excuse me. "Whoever oppresses a poor man insults his maker, but he who is generous to the needy honors him." At the beginning of Jesus' ministry, he read from the prophet Isaiah about himself in Luke chapter 4 and verse 18. "The Spirit of the Lord is upon me, because he has anointed me to proclaim good news to the poor." He also taught in Luke chapter 14 and verse 13, "But when you give a feast, invite the poor, the crippled, the lame, the blind, and you will be blessed, because they cannot repay you. For you will be repaid at the resurrection of the just." Or Jesus' own brother, James, in James chapter 2 and verse 5 wrote, "Listen, my beloved brothers, has not God chosen those who are poor in the world to be rich in faith and heirs of the kingdom which he has promised to those who love him?" You see, from our study tonight in Galatians chapter 2 and verse 10, that last verse of our section, what we learn is that the apostles were agreed on the importance of ministry to the poor because it flows from the center of the gospel. If you look at Galatians chapter 6 and verse 10, there's another important verse that I want us to notice. Galatians chapter 6 and verse 10. Listen to what he says there. He says, "Therefore, as we have opportunity, let us do good to all people, especially to those who belong to the family of believers. We should take care of our own who are members of God's family, but the heart of Christ also beats for those in the world who are in need." So we need to ask ourselves, how much do I care about the poor? And what am I doing to demonstrate my love and concern for them? There's an old Jewish tale that talks about how a young rabbi went up to an old and veteran rabbi to ask him a question about some of his congregation. And he said to the younger one, said to the older one, he said, whenever we stand or sit to read the Shema, you remember the Hear, O Israel, the Lord our God, the Lord is one. You shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, your soul, your mind, and your strength. And you should love your neighbor as yourself. He said, some of our people are upset if we don't all stand, and some of our people are upset if we don't all sit. And the younger rabbi said to the older rabbi, he said, is the congregation's tradition to stand? The older rabbi said, I don't believe that's our tradition. He said, well, is our tradition to sit? And the older rabbi said, I don't believe that is our tradition. And the younger rabbi became frustrated. He said, my congregants fight all the time. Every time we gather to worship, they begin yelling at each other to sit or to stand. And the older rabbi said, ah, yes, yelling at each other, that is our tradition. Unfortunately, our tradition has sometimes been known as the people who fight with each other and divide over too many things. But clearly, there are so many things that are not worth fighting about or fighting for. But two of the things that we looked at tonight that are worth fighting for are the truth of the gospel and the care of the poor. I hope you'll think about those things as you go about your week and as we grow in our understanding of the grace of God. I sure love you all. Thank you for joining us tonight.